Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku became the ultimate info broker after All Might's rejection. Here is short summary. After All Might says no, Izuku Midoriya gives up on being a hero and decides he's becoming a new person with the new name, Areos. He becomes an info broker for all heroes and villains alike as he joins the gray area of life. Join him on his hectic life journeys and enjoy. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. The wind was harsh atop the roof, carrying away the last few hopeful words Midoriya Izuku had dared to speak. But they were gone, as was All Might, his idol, his symbol of hope. Gone with the same devastating blow he'd just delivered. You can't be a hero without a quirk. Izuku's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold concrete, staring at the horizon with hollow eyes. His heart felt like it had shattered into a million pieces, scattered by the wind. He wasn't going to be a hero. He wasn't going to be like All Might. He wasn't going to be anything. Get up, a voice deep inside urged him, but it felt distant and weak. He didn't know how long he sat there, but eventually, the world darkened. As the stars began to blink into existence above him, the boy stood, dragging his feet down the stairs of the building. When he arrived home, he didn't tell his mother what happened. He couldn't bear to see her face twist in sadness, knowing her dreams for him had crumbled just like his own. Instead, he pretended everything was fine. He hugged her a little tighter that night, though. What he didn't know is it would be the last hug they'd share. It wasn't long after the rejection from All Might that Izuku's world was turned upside down once more. One of the countless villain attacks that plagued Mustafa had struck close to home. Too close. His mother, gone. His heart, already fragile, was now shattered forever beyond repair. There was no longer a home to return to, no safety net of love and warmth to fall into. Everything had been taken from him. And for what? All for a world that told him he couldn't be what he was born to be. Midoriya Izuku died that day. In his place was someone colder, sharper, someone with purpose, but a new one. The world of heroes had rejected him, but there was another world where knowledge was power, where you didn't need a quirk to survive. If he couldn't be a hero, he'd become something else. He'd become Areos, the name he chose to leave Midoriya behind. 1 year later, the underground was not what people thought. It wasn't just dark alleyways and backroom deals. It was an entire network of people, information, and resources flowing under the noses of heroes and villains alike. And at the center of it all was Areos. The wind swept through the dimly lit alleyways of Mustafa, carrying with it the scent of rain and the hum of a city that never truly slept. Midoriya Izuku, or Areos as he was known in the underground, pressed his back against the cold brick wall, his breath slow and measured as he listened to the footsteps of the hero patrol passing just meters away. He was good at this now. At 16, he had mastered the art of disappearing, staying unseen, unheard, while gathering information. He wasn't a hero. Not anymore. That dream had died alongside his mother, buried beneath the weight of a world that had no place for someone like him. No quirk, no future. Just his mind, sharper than ever, cutting through the lies and secrets of both the heroes and villains that fought for control of the city. The patrol passed without noticing him. He waited another moment before slipping out of the shadows, his hood pulled low over his face. His small apartment wasn't far, tucked away in a part of town the heroes rarely visited, but he wasn't heading there just yet. He had work to do. The first time he'd been approached by a member of the underworld, he hadn't realized what he was getting into. A low-level thug, part of a gang loosely associated with the League of Villains, had asked him for information. It was small at first, a hero's patrol schedule, a detail about a certain quirk user. But Izuku had known even then that this was a slippery slope. Still, what choice did he have? Information was all he had to trade. And if the heroes didn't want him, if the world rejected him, then the underground would become his home. He wasn't a villain. Not really. He just existed in the spaces between the law. By the time he realized he was dealing with the League of Villains themselves, it was too late to turn back. He became their silent informant, never getting his hands dirty, always one step removed from the violence they wrought. His dealings with the Yakuza were different, more businesslike. The Shi-Hasaikai had strict rules about how their information was used, and Izuku found their leader, Overhaul, to be calculating but oddly respectful in his own way. Both groups valued his skills, and Areos quickly became a name whispered in the dark corners of the city. Present day, Izuku's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, an encrypted message from one of his contacts. Meeting. Usual place. 15 minutes. That was unusual. Meetings were rare, and when they happened, they weren't planned on such short notice. Izuku's stomach tightened as he moved swiftly through the streets, keeping his head down. He had a network of hideouts and safehouses scattered across the city, but the one he was heading to was deep in villain territory. When he arrived, the small, dilapidated warehouse was empty, save for one figure standing in the shadows. Kurogiri, Izuku said softly, nodding in acknowledgement. The mist-like figure stepped forward. You've proven quite valuable to us, Areos, Kurogiri said in his smooth, low voice. But we have a new request. Izuku's pulse quickened. Every time the League asked for more, it pushed him further into their world, a world he wasn't sure he wanted to be a part of. But he couldn't refuse. Not now. What is it? Izuku asked, keeping his voice steady. Kurogiri's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Shigaraki has requested information on a certain pro hero. Eraserhead. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Aizawa Shota, the same man who had almost caught him weeks ago. He had barely escaped that encounter, slipping through the cracks of the city's underbelly before Aizawa could pull him into the light. Now, they wanted him to gather information on the man who had nearly taken him in. Eraserhead, Izuku repeated, trying to mask the unease in his voice. He's difficult to track. Kurogiri's gaze was unyielding. I'm sure you'll manage. You always do. Izuku nodded slowly. I'll get you what you need. As Kurogiri disappeared into his portal, leaving Izuku alone in the warehouse, the weight of the task settled on his shoulders. Eraserhead was one of the most dangerous heroes to cross, and now Izuku had to dig into his life, his routines, his vulnerabilities. He wasn't sure how much longer he could walk this line. Izuku's fingers flew over the keyboard as he pieced together what he knew about Eraserhead. His patterns were hard to track, his movements erratic, but there were clues. Small details he had picked up during his time observing the pro heroes, back when he still dreamed of being one of them. He found comfort in the research, the quiet focus it required. It was something he could control in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of his grasp. The more he delved into Aizawa's life, the more he felt a strange sense of connection. The man was closed off, isolated, someone who lived on the fringes of society, much like Izuku did now. But there was something else, something deeper, that tugged at Izuku's thoughts. Aizawa had a sense of justice that wasn't bound by the strict rules of hero society. He had seen it in their brief encounter, in the way Aizawa had spoken to him. Maybe, in another life, they could have understood each other. But that didn't matter now. Izuku had a job to do, and he couldn't let his feelings get in the way. A few weeks later, Izuku's work for the League and the Yakuza continued, though he remained careful to keep his own hands clean. He provided information, nothing more. He was a ghost, flitting between the shadows, watching the city from the cracks. But things were changing. The heroes were closing in. More than once, he had found himself narrowly escaping the grasp of pro-heroes, Endeavor, Hawks, and worst of all, Aizawa. The man seemed to have developed a personal interest in Areos, hunting him with a persistence that left Izuku on edge. It wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore. Aizawa was searching for something, though Izuku wasn't sure what. Each encounter left him more rattled, but he never let it show. He couldn't afford to. One night it had been raining for hours, the city streets slick and reflective under the dim glow of streetlights. Izuku was returning from a meeting with the Yakuza when he sensed it, the telltale prickle at the back of his neck. He was being followed. His heart raced, but his steps remained calm. He had to be careful, calculated. He ducked into an alleyway, pressing himself against the wall and waiting. The footsteps behind him slowed, then stopped. "I know you're there," came the voice. It was low, quiet, and unmistakable. Izuku's breath hitched. "Aizawa. I'm not going to hurt you," Aizawa continued, his tone calm but firm. "I just want to talk." Izuku stayed silent, every muscle in his body tense. He couldn't let Aizawa catch him, not now. Not after everything he had done. "Areos," Aizawa said, stepping into view. His dark eyes locked onto Izuku's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You're smart," Aizawa said softly. "But you're playing a dangerous game." Izuku swallowed hard. "I'm not a villain." "I know," Aizawa replied. "But the people you're working with are." "I don't have a choice," Izuku said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's always a choice." Izuku shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "Not for me. Not anymore." Aizawa took a step closer, his gaze softening. "It doesn't have to be this way." Izuku's chest tightened. He wanted to believe him, wanted to think that there was another path. But he couldn't. Not after everything he had done, everything he had seen. Before Aizawa could say anything else, Izuku turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Chapter text. Rain streaked down the windows of the cramped apartment Izuku called home, its rhythmic patter the only sound in the otherwise silent room. The dim glow of his laptop illuminated his face as he scrolled through various encrypted messages, each one a request for information, a breadcrumb that villains and criminals would follow to further their own twisted plans. But not today. Izuku closed the laptop and leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been weeks since the last close encounter with Aizawa, and yet the memory of the pro-hero's voice lingered in his mind. "It doesn't have to be this way." He had heard that line so many times from so many different people. His mother, before she died. All Might, before shattering his dream. And now Aizawa, the man hunting him like a ghost in the night. But what none of them understood was that Izuku no longer had a choice. This path, the underground, was all he had left. The League, the Yakuza, they both relied on him. And in a strange way, he had found a place among them. They weren't heroes, but they weren't liars either. They never pretended to be anything other than what they were, people surviving in a world that didn't care. The more Izuku dug into the dark corners of Mustafu, the more dangerous his life became. He wasn't just a broker anymore, he was a thread that connected all the wrong people to all the right secrets. He knew it wouldn't last forever. A soft chime broke through his thoughts, a notification. Izuku glanced at the screen. Another request. League. Urgent. Izuku's heart sank. Shigaraki was becoming more desperate, more unhinged. Each request from the League felt like another step closer to the abyss. He grabbed his hoodie and headed for the door. The air inside the building was stale, thick with dust and mildew. Izuku could hear the faint creak of the floors beneath his feet as he navigated the maze of narrow hallways. He was supposed to meet Kurogiri here, but the empty corridors made his skin crawl. Something felt off. As he turned a corner, a shadow moved in the distance. His breath caught in his throat, and his eyes darted to the nearest exit. But it was too late. "Areos," a voice rasped. Izuku spun around to see Shigaraki emerging from the shadows, his red eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. His fingers twitched, brushing against the walls with an almost casual destruction. "You're late," Shigaraki said, his tone accusing, though there was no real emotion behind it. Just the cold, detached calm of someone used to getting what he wanted. "I came as fast as I could," Izuku replied, keeping his voice even. He never liked being this close to Shigaraki. The man was unpredictable, dangerous. But more than that, there was something hollow about him, as if everything that made him human had been decayed long ago. Shigaraki stepped closer, his presence looming. "I need information on the heroes." "All of them." Izuku blinked, caught off guard. "All of them." Shigaraki's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. "We're done playing games. The heroes need to fall, and we're going to bring them down, one by one." A cold shiver ran down Izuku's spine. He had known the League was planning something big, but this was an all-out war. The lines were no longer blurred. Shigaraki wasn't asking for a simple tip on hero patrols, he was asking for the keys to the kingdom. "I can't give you that," Izuku said before he could stop himself. Shigaraki's smile vanished in an instant. The air between them grew thick with tension. You're refusing, Shigaraki hissed, stepping closer until Izuku could smell the stale scent of decay that seemed to cling to him. Izuku's mind raced. He couldn't afford to anger the League, but there was no way he could give Shigaraki everything. The information he was asking for would lead to countless deaths, and Izuku wasn't willing to be a part of that. Not even now. I can get you information on key heroes, those involved in the recent villain sweeps. But I can't expose everyone, Izuku said, his voice carefully controlled. It'll draw too much attention. Shigaraki's eyes narrowed, but after a long, tense silence, he nodded. Fine, start with Eraserhead. Izuku's stomach twisted. Of course it had to be Aizawa, the man who was already too close to figuring out who Areos really was. Shigaraki turned and began to walk away, his voice drifting back over his shoulder. You have 2 days. Don't disappoint me. Izuku watched him go, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of what Shigaraki was asking felt like it could crush him at any moment. But as much as he feared the League, he feared Aizawa's gaze even more. Later that night, Izuku found himself on the rooftops again, the city sprawling beneath him like a labyrinth of lights and shadows. This was where he felt safest, high above the streets, invisible to those below. He had always been a watcher, an observer, and up here, he could see everything. But tonight, he wasn't alone. You're getting sloppy, Areos. Izuku's heart leapt into his throat, and he spun around to see Aizawa standing on the opposite end of the rooftop, his scarf fluttering slightly in the breeze. The pro-hero's dark eyes were locked on him, unreadable as ever. How long have you been following me? Izuku asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Long enough, Aizawa replied, taking a step closer. I know you've been dealing with the League. And now, I'm giving you one chance to stop. Izuku clenched his fists. I'm not one of them. You know that. Do I? Aizawa's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Because from where I'm standing, you're running out of places to hide. Izuku's mind raced. He couldn't let Aizawa catch him, not here, not now. But there was something in the hero's voice that gave him pause. Aizawa wasn't just trying to capture him, he was trying to save him. But it was too late for that. I can't stop, Izuku said, his voice low. I don't have a choice. Aizawa's gaze softened, just slightly. There's always a choice. Izuku shook his head, taking a step back toward the edge of the rooftop. Not for me. Aizawa's eyes widened as he realized what Izuku was about to do. Don't. But before Aizawa could finish, Izuku stepped backward, plummeting over the edge of the building. The wind rushed past him, and for a split second, he felt weightless, free. But then his fingers caught the ledge of the lower roof, and he pulled himself up with practiced ease, disappearing into the shadows before Aizawa could reach him. He could hear Aizawa's frustrated shout in the distance, but it was already too late. Izuku was gone. Izuku stood in the same warehouse where Shigaraki had confronted him days before. His heart pounded in his chest as he handed over a file filled with information on Eraserhead. It wasn't much, just enough to satisfy Shigaraki without giving him everything. But it was still dangerous. Shigaraki flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he closed the file and nodded. You've done well, Areos. Izuku didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, one that he might not be able to come back from. As he turned to leave, Shigaraki's voice stopped him. Next time, you won't hold back. Izuku didn't look back as he disappeared into the night, the weight of Shigaraki's words pressing down on him like a vice. He had escaped Aizawa again, but for how long? And at what cost? Chapter text. The days stretched long and thin, as if time itself was unraveling with each passing moment. Izuku felt the pressure bearing down on him, the weight of decisions he could no longer run from. He had tried to stay neutral, playing both sides of the underground world, but neutrality had its price. The deeper he ventured into the labyrinth of villainy, the more tangled he became in the web of power that the League and the Yakuza held over Mustafu. Tonight was no different. Izuku crouched atop a water tower, his sharp eyes tracking the shadows of the streets below. Another information drop. Another dangerous dance between life and death. His phone buzzed once, then twice, a signal that the Yakuza were ready for the exchange. He hated these meetings, the silent tension that came with being in the presence of hardened criminals. Overhaul's men didn't talk much, but their eyes always carried the threat of violence, of consequences if Izuku didn't deliver. He was good at keeping his head down, avoiding the traps that came with being an info broker. But no matter how careful he was, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was starting to spiral out of control. Izuku stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his hood. His reflection looked back at him, worn, tired, older than 16 years should feel. The name Areos meant something in the underground, but it was starting to wear on him, to take its toll. He glanced down at his phone, where a message from the Yakuza contact blinked up at him. Need a safe house tonight. Location. Simple enough, but nothing was ever that easy in this line of work. He knew from his sources that there was a raid planned in the area tonight, heroes sweeping through the district in search of villain activity. The Yakuza's usual hideouts wouldn't be safe. Neither would most of the places he kept under wraps. If they were caught by the heroes, they'd be in his debt, one he didn't want to owe. Izuku quickly mapped out a route in his head. There was an old apartment complex, long abandoned and tucked away near the city's edge. It was perfect, a place the heroes wouldn't think to check. He typed the location back into his phone, hit send, and prayed he wasn't making a mistake. As he prepared to leave, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Izuku hesitated for a second before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, and it sent a chill down his spine. Areos, the voice said. I have a proposition for you. Izuku's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? You know who I am. The voice was smooth, calculated, almost mocking. It's time you stop hiding in the shadows. We have work to do. Together. The call ended as abruptly as it started, leaving Izuku standing there, the weight of his phone heavy in his hand. He didn't need to ask who it was. The League was moving faster now, more aggressively, and it was clear Shigaraki had plans that would change everything. Work together. The idea of aligning more fully with the League left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he pushed it aside for now. The Yakuza meeting came first. He could deal with Shigaraki later. Present time Izuku leapt down from the water tower, landing lightly on his feet as he made his way toward the meeting point. It was late, the streets mostly deserted save for the occasional passerby hurrying home. As he rounded a corner, he caught sight of his contact, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running across his face, flanked by two other Yakuza members. They waited in the shadows of a narrow alley, blending into the night like ghosts. Areos, the scarred man greeted him, his voice low and gravelly. You have the location. Izuku nodded, pulling a folded map from his jacket and handing it over. It's an old complex. Abandoned. The heroes won't think to check there. The man took the map, his eyes scanning it briefly before he tucked it into his coat. Good. You've done well. There was a pause, a heavy silence that hung in the air. Izuku knew better than to ask questions, but his instincts were screaming at him, something wasn't right. Before he could voice his concerns, the sound of footsteps echoed from the alley's entrance. The Yakuza men stiffened, their hands inching toward their weapons. Izuku's heart raced as he turned, half expecting to see a hero patrol. But it wasn't heroes. A figure stepped into the light, a young woman, her black hair tied in a neat bun, her face calm and expressionless. She wore the traditional suit of the Yakuza, but there was something about her that made Izuku uneasy. Boss wants to see you, she said simply, her eyes locking onto Izuku. Izuku blinked, caught off guard. What, now? The woman nodded. You've been useful, but it's time to talk about your future with us. The room was cold, sterile, and unnervingly quiet. Izuku sat across from Overhaul, the infamous leader of the Shihasaikai. Overhaul's mask gleamed faintly in the dim light, his eyes sharp and calculating as they studied Izuku with unsettling intensity. You've been useful to us, Areos, Overhaul began, his voice smooth yet chilling. But we need more than just information. We need someone who understands the system, who can help us navigate it. Izuku swallowed hard, keeping his expression neutral. I provide intel. That's what I do. And you do it well, Overhaul replied, leaning back slightly in his chair. But I'm offering you something more. A place in the organization. Power, protection, resources. You've seen the way the heroes operate. They won't stop until they've crushed everyone in their way. The Yakuza are different. We have structure, honor. You could have a real future with us. Izuku's mind raced. The offer was tempting. Too tempting. But it wasn't as simple as accepting or refusing. Aligning himself more fully with the Yakuza meant severing any last thread of hope he had for living in the daylight. It meant cementing himself in a world of crime. Think about it, Izuku said carefully, knowing he couldn't make any rash decisions here. Overhaul's gaze darkened slightly, but he nodded. Don't think too long, Areos. In this world, hesitation can be. Aizawa Shota stood in front of the large map that dominated his office wall, his eyes narrowing at the cluster of red pins marking recent villain activity. He had been chasing Areos for weeks now, always one step behind. The kid was slippery, too smart for his own good, always disappearing just before Aizawa could close in. But that didn't mean Aizawa was going to give up. He leaned closer to the map, his sharp mind piecing together patterns, analyzing connections. He had been keeping an eye on the Yakuza's movements, and something about the recent surge in activity didn't sit right with him. Areos had to be involved. But there was something else, something deeper. Aizawa had watched the kid long enough to know he wasn't like the others in the underground. He wasn't a villain, not yet, but he's getting there. Aizawa sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had his own demons to deal with, his own history that made it difficult to see a kid like Areos slip through the cracks. He wasn't one for second chances, but something about this kid kept pulling him back, kept making him think that maybe, just maybe, there was still time. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from the agency. Villain raid in progress. Yakuza territory. Suit up. Aizawa's eyes narrowed as he grabbed his gear. He had a feeling this wasn't just another raid. Areos was involved. He could feel it. Izuku hadn't expected the heroes to find him so soon. He had barely left the Yakuza headquarters when the first explosion rocked the streets, sending debris flying and people screaming in every direction. His instincts kicked in, and he darted into the nearest alley, his heart pounding as the sounds of battle echoed through the air. Heroes. They were raiding the Yakuza's territory, and judging by the intensity of the attack, this wasn't just a routine sweep. This was a full-scale assault. Izuku's mind raced. He needed to get out. Now, he turned to run, but before he could take another step, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. Areos. Chapter text. Mustafu, Yakuza territory. Izuku's heart raced as he ducked behind a pile of rubble. The street was a war zone, and the blaring sirens of hero vehicles mixed with the cacophony of explosions and gunfire. Smoke billowed into the air, thick and choking, turning the night into a haze of chaos. The Yakuza's territory had become a battleground, and Izuku was caught in the middle of it. He had been so focused on escaping the Yakuza's headquarters that he didn't realize the heroes were already closing in. His instincts had been right. The raid wasn't a routine sweep. It was an all-out assault designed to crush the Yakuza once and for all. Izuku peered around the corner of his cover. Hero uniforms, lights flashing, and the unmistakable presence of Eraserhead among them. He could see Aizawa's distinctive scarf cutting through the smoke as he led the charge. This is bad. Izuku needed to move. He couldn't afford to be seen, especially not with Aizawa so close. He carefully assessed his surroundings. The alleyways were a maze of potential hiding spots, but they also posed significant risks. He had to find a way out of the immediate danger. He sprinted toward an old drainage system he knew well, a perfect escape route. Just as he reached the entrance, he heard Aizawa's voice through the chaos. Areos. Stop. Izuku's blood ran cold. Aizawa had spotted him. There was no escape through the drainage system. He had to find another way. He glanced around and saw a fire escape ladder leading to the roof of a nearby building. It was a risk, but it was his best option. He dashed for the ladder, climbing quickly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. On the roof, Izuku scrambled onto the roof, his mind racing. He could hear the distant thud of footsteps and the occasional burst of energy from hero quirks. The roof offered a temporary respite, but it wasn't secure. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The view from up here was unsettling. The city was a sea of flashing lights and smoke, the sounds of conflict echoing from all directions. He needed to think quickly. As he crouched low, he caught sight of a shadow moving across the rooftop. Instinctively, he ducked behind a ventilation unit. He peeked out and saw Aizawa climbing onto the roof, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "Areos," Aizawa called out again, his voice cutting through the chaos. "There's nowhere to run. Come out and face me." Izuku's heart pounded. Aizawa was getting closer, and he needed a plan. His eyes scanned the roof for anything he could use. He spotted a small air vent and made his way towards it, hoping it would lead him to safety. As he pried the vent open and started to crawl through, he heard Aizawa's voice again, closer this time. "Stop hiding. This doesn't have to end like this." Izuku pushed forward, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at him. The vent led to a narrow maintenance shaft. He moved quickly, trying to stay ahead of Aizawa. The shaft was cramped, and he could hear Aizawa's footsteps getting louder as he followed. Just as Izuku emerged from the shaft and into a large, empty room, he heard a loud crash behind him. Aizawa had followed him into the building, and there was no time to waste. He had to keep moving. Inside the building, Izuku ran through the building, his breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. He navigated the corridors, avoiding the main areas where heroes were likely to be searching. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anxiety and adrenaline as he tried to stay one step ahead. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. Aizawa was relentless, and sooner or later, he would catch up. But there was still a chance he could find a way out. He had to. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a group of Yakuza members who were also trying to escape the raid. They looked at him with surprise and then recognition. "Areos," one of them shouted, grabbing his arm. "You're not safe here. The heroes are everywhere." "I know," Izuku said, shaking off the man's grip. "I'm trying to find a way out." The Yakuza members nodded in understanding and quickly pointed him towards a hidden exit, a service tunnel that led to the underground. It was a long shot, but it was his best bet. Izuku sprinted toward the tunnel, hoping that Aizawa wouldn't catch up before he could get away. Aizawa's frustration was mounting. He had been on Areos' trail for weeks, and every time he thought he was close, the kid slipped away. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was determined to end this chase. As he moved through the building, he could hear the distant sounds of conflict and the occasional burst of light from hero quirks. The building was a maze of rooms and hallways, and Areos was somewhere within it. He paused for a moment, listening. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors. Aizawa's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of movement and he followed it, moving quickly. He reached the service tunnel just as Areos was about to disappear inside. Without hesitation, Aizawa leapt forward, grabbing the edge of the tunnel's entrance and pulling himself inside. The service tunnel was dark and narrow, the air musty and stale. Izuku moved quickly, trying to stay ahead of Aizawa. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a winding path through the underground. He could hear Aizawa's footsteps growing louder behind him, and he pushed himself harder, his muscles aching with the effort. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He needed a plan, a way to throw Aizawa off his trail. Up ahead, he saw a small alcove in the tunnel wall. It was a tight fit, but if he could hide there, he might be able to evade Aizawa for a few moments. He darted into the alcove and pressed himself against the wall, trying to control his breathing. The footsteps grew closer, and Izuku held his breath, hoping that Aizawa wouldn't see him. He could hear the pro-hero's footsteps slowing, his breathing heavy as he scanned the tunnel. Aizawa paused just outside the alcove, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. For a moment, it seemed like he might spot Izuku. But then he moved on, continuing down the tunnel. Izuku let out a sigh of relief as he waited for a few moments before cautiously emerging from his hiding spot. He continued through the tunnel, his mind racing as he tried to think of his next move. Outside, a hidden safe house. Izuku finally emerged from the tunnel into a small, hidden safe house. The place was old and dusty, but it was secure, an old hideout from the early days of his work in the underground. It wasn't much, but it would keep him safe for a little while. He collapsed onto a dusty couch, his body shaking with exhaustion. The adrenaline from the chase was beginning to wear off, and he was left feeling drained. His thoughts turned to Aizawa. The pro-hero had been relentless in his pursuit, and despite everything, there was a part of Izuku that felt conflicted. Aizawa was trying to catch him, but there was something in his voice, a hint of concern, a desire to help. Izuku shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't afford to think about that right now. He needed to focus on finding a way out of this mess, on staying one step ahead of both the heroes and the villains. As he sat there, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, he received another message on his phone. It was from Shigaraki. The offer still stands. You have a choice to make. Izuku stared at the message, his mind reeling. Shigaraki's offer was still on the table. Join the League, or continue living in the shadows. It was a decision he would have to make soon, but for now, he had to focus on surviving the night. He leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. The city outside was still in chaos, and his place in it was more uncertain than ever. Chapter text. The safe house was a small, forgotten relic of a past life. Dust and neglect had claimed the place, but to Izuku, it was a sanctuary. He sat on the edge of the worn couch, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The evening's events had left him physically and mentally exhausted. He glanced around the dimly lit room, the only light coming from a small, flickering lamp in the corner. The shadows danced on the walls, creating eerie shapes that seemed to mock his current predicament. Izuku pulled out his phone and stared at the message from Shigaraki. The League's offer was still on the table, but the decision was becoming increasingly difficult. As he pondered his next move, his phone buzzed again, drawing his attention. This time, it was an encrypted message from an unknown number. With a sense of foreboding, he opened it. The time is near. Be prepared for a choice. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Midnight. Izuku's heart raced. The message was cryptic but urgent. It was clear that someone was orchestrating events from the shadows. He had to go. There might be answers waiting for him, or at least a lead on how to navigate the escalating chaos. Midnight. Old warehouse on 5th Street. The warehouse was abandoned, its exterior weathered and broken down. It had long been forgotten by most, but for those who knew where to look, it was a place of significance. Izuku approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. The area was eerily silent, the only sounds being his footsteps and the distant hum of the city. He slipped through a side door and moved into the warehouse's vast, empty interior. The space was cavernous, with beams of moonlight filtering through cracked windows and broken roof panels. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, creating an unsettling atmosphere. He moved deeper into the warehouse, his steps echoing in the cavernous space. As he reached the center, he saw a figure standing near a stack of crates, an imposing silhouette in the dim light. The figure was cloaked, their features hidden beneath a hood. "I'm here," Izuku called out cautiously. "Who are you?" The figure turned, their face still concealed by the hood. "Areos," the voice was calm, with a hint of authority. "You've been a thorn in many sides. But tonight, we offer clarity." Izuku narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, revealing a brief flash of a mask, one that was both familiar and foreign. "I'm someone who understands the weight you carry, the crossroads you face." Before Izuku could respond, the figure tossed a small device toward him. It landed at his feet, and he recognized it as a data pad, one that he had seen in the possession of high-level underground operatives. "Take it," the figure said. "It contains information about the current power plays within the underground and the hero agencies. You need to know who's truly pulling the strings." Izuku hesitated, but curiosity and necessity drove him to pick up the data pad. He activated it, and a series of documents and files appeared on the screen. There were details about the Yakuza, the League of Villains, and various hero agencies, including sensitive information that made Izuku's blood run cold. "This is," he began, but the figure interrupted. It's everything you need to make an informed decision. The League and the Yakuza are only part of a larger game. The real power lies elsewhere, and you must choose your allies wisely. Izuku looked up, but the figure was already retreating into the shadows. Wait, who are you? Why help me? The figure's voice echoed from the darkness. The answer lies in the choices you make. Trust the information. You're not alone in this fight. With that, the figure disappeared, leaving Izuku alone with the data pad and a heavy sense of uncertainty. Aizawa's office. Early morning. Aizawa sat at his desk, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He was poring over the latest reports from the raid, his eyes scanning for any clues about Areos' whereabouts. The night had been chaotic, and despite his efforts, Areos had managed to slip through his grasp again. His phone buzzed with a new message, pulling him from his thoughts. It was from his contact in the Hero Agency, a brief but troubling update. Areos' activities have intensified. Intelligence suggests potential connections with other factions. Aizawa frowned. The mention of other factions confirmed his suspicions. Areos was tangled in something much larger than a simple criminal network. He had to find the kid. There was more at stake than just capturing him. The more he read, the more Aizawa realized that Areos' role was crucial in a much broader conflict. If he could just find a way to approach the kid without escalating the situation, he might just be able to get through to him. Izuku's safe house. Later that morning, Izuku spent the night going through the data pad's information. It was, well, to put it lightly, overwhelming. The scope of the conflicts, the hidden agendas, the alliances and betrayals. It painted a grim picture of the world he was caught in. As dawn broke, he leaned back against the wall, exhausted but determined. The information was invaluable, but it was clear that he had to make a decision soon. The League's offer, the Yakuza's power, and now the mysterious figure's advice, it was all converging into a critical moment. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He tensed, instinctively reaching for a nearby weapon. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the small window. To his surprise, it was a package, left on the doorstep. He opened it carefully, revealing a neatly folded letter and a small, inconspicuous key. The letter read, Areos, you are on the brink of a decision that will shape your future. Use this key to access a new safe house. Inside, you will find more information about the factions vying for power. It's up to you to decide where your loyalty lies. Time is of the essence. Choose wisely. Izuku's mind raced. The letter confirmed that there was more to uncover, more decisions to make. He took the key and pocketed it, determined to find the new safe house and unravel the remaining mysteries. As he prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to shift dramatically. Every choice he made now would have far-reaching consequences, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. Chapter text. Mustafu. New safe house. Izuku arrived at the new safe house, a nondescript building hidden in plain sight among other mundane structures. It was clear that the mystery caller had gone to great lengths to ensure its secrecy. The building was an old office space, now converted into a secure hideout. He used the key from the package to unlock a side door, stepping into a dimly lit room. The interior was clean and organized, a stark contrast to the chaotic state of his previous hideout. There were supplies, maps, and several more data pads neatly arranged. Izuku immediately noticed a desk with a computer set up and a single file marked, urgent. He approached the desk, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. He opened the file, which contained a detailed overview of the various factions vying for control in the underground and hero world. Among the documents, there was a note, written in a familiar script. Areos, I knew you would find this. It's time for you to learn the truth. Meet me at the old library at noon. The answers you seek are there. Izuku's mind raced. The note seemed to be from the same mysterious figure who had given him the data pad. There was something personal in the handwriting, an odd sense of familiarity that gnawed at him. Noon. Old library. The old library was a relic from a bygone era, its grandeur now faded. It had been closed to the public for years but was still maintained by a few dedicated individuals. The building had an air of quiet decay, with dust covering shelves that once held countless books. Izuku entered the library cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He made his way to the back, where a series of hidden rooms were rumored to exist. The note had been clear. The answers were here. As he approached the designated room, he heard the faint sound of footsteps. He turned to see the mysterious figure from before, standing in the shadows. This time, the figure was not cloaked but wore a sophisticated suit and a mask that concealed their identity. "Areos," the figure said, their voice calm and measured. "You've followed the trail well." Izuku's eyes were fixed on the figure. "Who are you? Why are you helping me?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing their face for the first time. It was a woman in her mid-30s, with piercing blue eyes and an authoritative presence. She removed the mask, revealing a strikingly familiar face. "I'm someone who has been watching your progress," she said. "My name is Reika Nakamura. I'm the head of an organization dedicated to uncovering the truth behind the hidden conflicts in Mustafu." Izuku's eyes widened in recognition. "Nakamura, are you related to—" "Yes," Reika interrupted gently. "I'm the sister of Kato Nakamura, the former leader of the Yakuza. My brother's death was a significant turning point in the underground world, and I've been working to stabilize the chaos that followed." Izuku's mind raced. "Why have you been helping me? What's your interest in me?" Reika sighed, her expression serious. "Because you're caught in the middle of a much larger conflict. You've become a crucial piece in this puzzle, and your actions will determine the future of this city. I'm here to offer you guidance and support." Izuku shook his head. "But why me? I'm just a quirkless vigilante." Reika's gaze softened. "You underestimate your impact. Your decisions and actions have far-reaching consequences. The League of Villains, the Yakuza, and even the hero agencies, they all have their agendas. But you have the opportunity to influence the outcome." She handed Izuku a folder containing more detailed information about various factions, their leaders, and their objectives. "This will give you a clearer picture of the power dynamics at play. You need to understand who's truly in control and what their motivations are." Izuku took the folder, his hands trembling. "And what about the heroes? Especially Eraserhead, what's his role in all of this?" Reika's expression became guarded. "Eraserhead is a complex figure. He's one of the few heroes who operate outside the usual constraints. His actions are driven by his own sense of justice, but his methods can be unpredictable. He's searching for you not just as a potential threat but as someone who might need help." Izuku looked up, his mind whirling with the new information. "Help? Why would he want to help me?" Reika's eyes were filled with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "Because he sees the potential in you. He recognizes that you're more than just a useless, quirkless vigilante. You're a person who's been forced into a difficult situation and is trying to find his way. He wants to offer you a chance, but his methods might not align with your goals." Izuku took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "So, what do I do now?" Reika placed a hand on his shoulder. "You need to make a choice. The path you take will shape the future of Mustafu. You can align yourself with the League, the Yakuza, or even find your own path. But whatever you decide, you must be prepared for the consequences." As Reika turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Izuku. "One more thing. Aizawa Shota's interest in you is genuine. He's not just another obstacle. There's more to his intentions, and it might be worth considering." With that, Reika exited the library, leaving Izuku alone with his thoughts. The weight of the decision ahead was daunting, but he now had more information to guide his choices. Aizawa's office. Later that day, Aizawa was poring over reports when his phone buzzed with an alert. It was a message from one of his contacts, confirming that Reika Nakamura had been seen meeting with Areos. Aizawa's expression hardened. Reika Nakamura was a significant player in the underground world, and her involvement with Areos raised serious concerns. He needed to understand what was happening and why Areos was so central to these unfolding events. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "I need an update on Reika Nakamura's activities and her connections to Areos. We're missing key pieces of this puzzle, and I want them now." As he ended the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was evolving beyond his control. Areos was at the heart of a larger conflict, and Aizawa's pursuit was becoming more than just a mission to capture a fugitive. It was a quest to understand the true nature of the struggle that was tearing Mustafa apart. Izuku's safe house. Evening. Izuku returned to the safe house, his mind buzzing with the revelations from Reika. The new information provided clarity, but it also intensified the complexity of his situation. He spread out the documents and maps on a table, trying to make sense of everything. The factions were intricate, each with its own motivations and strategies. He needed to think strategically, to choose his alliances carefully. As he was reviewing the files, he received another message on his phone. It was from Shigaraki. The offer still stands. Make your move, Areos. The clock is ticking. Izuku took a deep breath. The decision was looming closer. He had to weigh his options and decide where his loyalties would lie. Each choice would have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself but for the city he was trying to protect. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but he had the tools to navigate it. It was time to step into the shadows and shape the future of Mustafa. Chapter text. Mustafa, Izuku's safe house. The safe house was deathly quiet, save for the faint scratching of pen on paper. Izuku hunched over a table, his fingers working at a feverish pace as he scrawled notes in the margins of various documents. His eyes, slightly bloodshot from lack of sleep, darted across maps and files, piecing together the intricate puzzle of Mustafa's underground power dynamics. His life had become one giant research project. The stakes, however, were far greater than a simple school exam. This was about survival, his own, and potentially that of the entire city. His phone buzzed on the table, the notification pulling his attention from the chaos of information before him. The message was from none other than Shigaraki. Time's running out. Make a decision soon. Izuku sighed and set the phone aside, feeling the weight of the message settle over him. Shigaraki's proposition still hung like a dark cloud, promising both opportunity and danger. He knew better than to trust the League of Villains completely, but his options were growing fewer by the day. He couldn't deny the allure of being part of a group that operated outside of the law, especially with the loss of his mother still fresh in his mind. The sound of a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His heart immediately sped up. He hadn't been expecting anyone. Cautiously, he approached the door, peeking through the peephole. Relief washed over him when he saw Rika Nakamura on the other side, her typically calm demeanor slightly disrupted by what looked like concern. Izuku opened the door, his brow furrowed. Rika, what's going on? Can I come in? Rika asked, her voice firm yet carrying an underlying tension. Izuku nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Rika wasted no time, her eyes scanning the cluttered space as she entered. You've been busy, she remarked, eyeing the documents sprawled across the room. Izuku shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. I'm just trying to make sense of all this. There's so much happening under the surface in Mustafa. Rika sat down, pulling one of the documents closer to her. She skimmed it before looking up at Izuku, her gaze intense. That's why I'm here. There's something you need to know. Izuku tensed slightly. Rika Nakamura was someone he trusted. She had become one of the few people in his life who understood the complexity of the underground world. Still, whenever she had that particular look in her eyes, it meant things were about to get complicated. What is it? Izuku asked, folding his arms across his chest. Rika leaned forward. I've been following some rumors about the underground factions and their movements. There's something big brewing, something that could shift the entire power structure in the city. Izuku frowned, feeling his pulse quicken. Go on. Rika hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. There's talk of a high-level negotiation between one of the hero agencies and an underground group, either the League or the Yakuza. If this deal goes through, it could mean a total realignment of power in Mustafa. It's not just about control anymore. This could change everything. Izuku stared at her, the weight of her words settling heavily on his mind. But why would a hero agency negotiate with them? Rika shook her head. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's desperation or greed, or maybe there's something bigger at play. But either way, If you decide to side with the League or the Yakuza, you're going to find yourself in the middle of that mess. Izuku chewed on his lip, deep in thought. He had always known his involvement with the underground would be dangerous, but this was something else. The stakes were growing larger with each passing day, and he was just a quirkless vigilante trying to carve out his place in the chaos. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't from Shigaraki. It was from Aizawa. Areos, we need to talk. Meet me at the abandoned warehouse near the docks. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Meeting Aizawa could be risky, especially now, with everything hanging in the balance. But Aizawa had always been a wild card, neither fully aligned with the hero system nor completely opposed to those who operated outside of it. I just got a message from Aizawa, Izuku said, showing Rika the phone. He wants to meet. Rika's eyes darkened slightly as she processed the message. You think he knows about everything? I don't know, Izuku admitted. But if he's reaching out, it's probably important. Rika sighed, leaning back in her chair. You need to be careful. Aizawa isn't like other heroes. He's not bound by the same rules, but that makes him unpredictable. He could be trying to recruit you, or he could be assessing whether you're a threat. Izuku nodded slowly. I'll go. Maybe I can get more information from him. Rika stood up, her posture stiff. I'm coming with you. If there's something going on with the hero agencies and the underground, we need to know as much as possible. Abandoned warehouse. Old docks. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette casting long shadows over the water. Izuku and Rika approached cautiously, sticking to the darkness as they made their way inside. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rust, the old metal of the building creaking with age. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Aizawa stood in the center of the room, his face obscured by his signature scarf. He didn't move as they approached, his eyes hidden beneath a curtain of unkempt hair. Areos, Aizawa said in a low voice. I'm glad you decided to show up. Izuku exchanged a quick glance with Rika before stepping forward. You asked me to come. What's this about? Aizawa's gaze shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. You've made a name for yourself in the underground world. It's only a matter of time before you're dragged into something you can't handle. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about? Aizawa's tone was calm, almost detached. There's a negotiation happening between one of the hero agencies and the Yakuza. It's being kept quiet, but it's causing a lot of tension in Mustafu. The heroes are divided on how to handle it, and the underground is becoming more volatile by the day. You're in the middle of all of this, whether you like it or not. Rika crossed her arms, her voice cold. Why do you care what happens to Izuku? Aizawa's eyes flickered toward Rika, and for a moment, the tension in the room grew thick. Because I don't want to see someone like him get crushed by the weight of the world. Izuku clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. What do you want from me, Aizawa? You've been watching me for a while now. Why? Aizawa stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Because you remind me of myself when I was younger. Caught between what's right and what's necessary. I'm offering you a way out, but you need to decide whether you want it. Rika stepped forward, her voice steady. And if he doesn't take your offer? Aizawa's expression hardened slightly. Then he's on his own. The weight of Aizawa's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Izuku knew that the path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger at every turn. The temptation to align with the underground was strong, but the consequences were even stronger. I need time to think, Izuku finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Aizawa nodded. I figured as much. Just don't take too long. The window for making a decision is closing. With that, Aizawa turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Rika stood beside Izuku, her arms crossed as they watched him leave. What now? She asked, her voice soft but urgent. Izuku's mind raced, the weight of the choice before him growing heavier with each passing second. We need to gather more information, he said finally. Whatever's going on with the hero agencies and the underground, we need to understand it completely before making any moves. Rika nodded, her gaze unwavering. Agreed. But whatever happens, we need to be ready. Mustafu, Izuku's safe house. Back at the safe house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Izuku sat at the table once more, his fingers tracing the edges of the documents Rika had brought with her. The information was valuable, but it still didn't provide the full picture. Rika stood by the window, watching the city lights in the distance. You know, Aizawa's right. You're in a dangerous position. Izuku sighed. I know, but I can't just sit back and let things happen around me. Rika turned, her expression serious. Just promise me one thing. Whatever decision you make, don't lose yourself in the process. Izuku looked up at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. I won't. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. But in that silence, a quiet resolve began to form. Izuku knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but with Rika by his side, he had the knowledge and the resolve to face them. The coming days would be critical, and his decisions would shape the future of the city he sought to protect. The night settled over Mustafu like a suffocating blanket. The city streets were still active, but Izuku's small hideout was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of passing vehicles. Inside, he stood by the window, staring out into the sprawling chaos of the city below, his thoughts a tangle of uncertainty and pressure. Rika Nakamura sat on the far end of the room, leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed. Her sharp eyes tracked every movement Izuku made, a watchful tension hanging between them. She was no stranger to the underground, nor to the complexity of their situation. But what troubled her now was the undeniable distance that had grown between her and Izuku, despite the shared purpose that had brought them together. Their relationship, once forged on common goals, had become strained. Trust was still present, but it was fragile. The weight of secrets, conflicting objectives, and personal baggage hung in the air like a cloud, always threatening to burst. What's your next move? Rika finally broke the silence, her tone detached but probing. Izuku didn't turn to face her. His green eyes stayed fixed on the city. I'm still trying to figure that out. Rika's brow furrowed. We don't have time for indecision. The League is expecting an answer, and Aizawa won't wait forever. Izuku knew she was right. But things weren't as simple as choosing sides. The League of Villains had made their offer, and so had Aizawa. Both presented opportunities, and both carried enormous risks. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about influence, about shaping the city and its underground network in ways that no one else could. But more than that, Izuku had his own mission. Finding out who was responsible for the attack that killed his mother. Rika, Izuku began, his voice quiet but deliberate, do you trust me? The question hung in the air, and Rika didn't answer right away. She knew he was looking for reassurance, but her guarded nature prevented her from offering it so easily. I trust your abilities, she said at last. But that's not the same as trusting your judgment. Izuku tensed at her words, though he tried not to show it. He understood her hesitation. After all, their situation was far from normal. He was a quirkless vigilante navigating the dangerous labyrinth of the underground, and she was one of the few people who knew the full extent of his activities. You're not just dealing with information anymore, Rika continued, her gaze hardening. You're making decisions that are going to affect a lot of people, heroes, villains, civilians. You can't afford to make the wrong call. Izuku turned to her now, meeting her intense gaze with his own. I know that. For a moment, silence filled the room, both of them watching each other carefully. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge the growing tension, but it was impossible to ignore. They were two people moving along different paths, forced to work together out of necessity. But the cracks were starting to show. I'm going to meet with the Yakuza tomorrow, Izuku said suddenly, breaking the stalemate between them. Rika's eyes widened, the calm exterior she usually wore slipping for just a second. You're what? They've been moving quietly in the city, Izuku explained. There's been talk about their role in the power shift that's happening. I need to know where they stand, and if they have any information that can help. Rika stood up, her body language tense. Do you think that's a good idea? The Yakuza aren't like the League of Villains. They operate by their own code, and they don't take kindly to outsiders trying to get involved in their affairs. You're putting yourself in danger. I know the risks, Izuku replied evenly. But I need to know more. If I can understand their position, I might be able to use it to our advantage. Rika frowned, folding her arms. Our advantage, or yours? The question hit harder than Izuku expected, but he didn't flinch. Rika had always been able to see through people's motivations with alarming clarity, and she wasn't afraid to call him out when she felt he was being selfish. This isn't just about me, Izuku said, his voice firm but without aggression. It's about what's best for the city. The heroes are fractured, the underground's growing in power, and I need to make sure that things don't spiral out of control. Rika didn't respond immediately, her mind working through the implications of what Izuku was saying. She couldn't deny that the city was teetering on the edge of chaos. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that Izuku was walking a fine line between becoming a force for change and being swallowed by the very world he was trying to navigate. I'll go with you, she said after a moment, her voice resigned but steady. Izuku blinked in surprise. You don't have to. I'm not giving you a choice, she cut him off, her tone making it clear that this wasn't up for debate. You're walking into a dangerous situation, and I'm not letting you handle it alone. For a moment, Izuku considered protesting, but he knew better. Rika wasn't someone who would back down once her mind was made up. And, as much as he hated to admit it, her presence would probably make things easier. She had a sharp mind, and her instincts had saved him more than once already. Fine, he said finally. But we need to be careful. The Yakuza don't make deals lightly, and I don't want to end up on their bad side. Rika smirked slightly, the tension between them easing just a fraction. You're not the only one who knows how to handle negotiations, Areos. Izuku rolled his eyes at the use of his underground alias. Yeah, just try not to start any fights. Rika didn't respond, but the glint in her eyes told him that she was more than ready to handle whatever came their way. Mustafu, Yakuza hideout. The following day, Izuku and Rika found themselves standing in front of a nondescript building tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It didn't look like much from the outside, but the guard stationed near the entrance were a clear indication that this wasn't just any ordinary establishment. Izuku's heart raced as he and Rika approached the building. He had done his research, and he knew that the Yakuza were not to be trifled with. But the need for information, and the possibility of finding out more about his mother's death, was driving him forward. Remember, Izuku whispered as they neared the door, let me do the talking. Rika gave him a sideways glance. Just don't screw it up. The guards eyed them suspiciously as they approached, but they didn't make any move to stop them. Izuku had arranged this meeting carefully, ensuring that the Yakuza knew he wasn't coming as a threat, but as someone with valuable information. One of the guards stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. You're the one they call Areos. Izuku nodded, trying to keep his nerves in check. That's right, I have information that might be of interest to your boss. The guard didn't respond immediately, his eyes flicking between Izuku and Rika. After a moment, he stepped aside, motioning for them to follow him inside. The interior of the building was sparse but well maintained. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the faint hum of conversation. Izuku could feel the weight of the Yakuza's presence all around him, their eyes watching his every move. They were led to a large room where several men sat around a table, their postures relaxed but alert. At the head of the table sat a man with slicked back hair and a sharp suit, his eyes betraying nothing as he looked them over. So, the man said, his voice smooth and controlled. You're the infamous Areos. I've heard quite a bit about you. Izuku forced himself to remain calm. I'm here because I believe we have mutual interests. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Oh, and what might those interests be? Izuku glanced at Rika, who stood a few steps behind him, her expression unreadable. He knew that this was a delicate situation, and one wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. I've been following the shifts in power within Mustafu, Izuku began, his voice steady. The heroes are fractured, and the underground is gaining influence. But that also means there's a lot of instability, and instability leads to chaos. The man leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. Go on. Izuku took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I believe that we can help each other maintain control. You have resources, connections, and I have information. Together, we can ensure that the city doesn't fall into complete anarchy." For a moment, the man didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Izuku. The tension in the room was palpable, and Izuku could feel his pulse quicken as he waited for the man's reaction. Finally, the man chuckled, a low, almost dangerous sound. "You're an interesting one, Areos. But tell me, why should I trust you?" Izuku met the man's gaze head-on. "Because I have no reason to betray you. My goal is to keep the city stable, not to tear it apart. And if we work together, we can ensure that happens." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well, I'll consider your proposal, but know this, if you cross me, there will be consequences." "I understand," Izuku replied, keeping his voice steady. With that, the meeting came to an end, and Izuku and Rika were escorted out of the building. As they walked back into the night, the tension between them still lingered, but there was a new sense of understanding as well. "You handled that better than I expected," Rika admitted, her tone grudgingly respectful. Izuku smirked. "Thanks, I think." Rika glanced at him, her expression softening for just a moment before the familiar guarded look returned. "Just don't get cocky, Areos. This is only the beginning." The atmosphere in Izuku's hideout was thick with tension as he and Rika Nakamura returned from their meeting with the Yakuza. The weight of their discussion had left both of them visibly drained. Izuku paced back and forth, deep in thought, while Rika sat on the couch, her eyes scanning the room but her mind clearly elsewhere. "So, what now?" Rika's voice broke the silence, her tone tinged with frustration. "We've made contact with the Yakuza, but we still don't know where they truly stand or what their next move will be." Izuku stopped his pacing and glanced at her. "We need to keep our options open. The League and the Yakuza are both unpredictable. We need to find a way to use that to our advantage." Rika's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about playing both sides against each other. That's dangerous." "I know," Izuku replied, his voice steady. "But it's the only way to maintain control. If we can manipulate the situation, we might be able to steer it towards a more manageable outcome." Rika sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're not wrong, but the risk involved is enormous. You could end up alienating both sides, and if that happens—" "If it happens," Izuku cut her off, "we'll deal with it. But right now, we need to gather more information. We need to understand what the Yakuza and the League are planning, and we need to act before things get out of hand." Rika looked at him, her expression a mix of concern and resignation. "All right, what's the plan?" Izuku paused, considering his next move. "The League of Villains has been quiet lately. They're plotting something, and it's likely connected to the recent power shifts. I'm going to need to make contact with them again, see if I can gather more intelligence. In the meantime, you should keep an eye on the Yakuza and see if you can pick up any useful information." Rika raised an eyebrow. "You think I can just waltz into their territory and start asking questions?" Izuku smirked. "You've managed to get us this far, haven't you?" Rika's lips curved into a faint smile. "Fair point. I'll see what I can dig up." League of Villains hideout. The atmosphere was tense in the League of Villains hideout. The dimly lit room was filled with the murmurs of its members, their faces obscured by shadows. The League had been laying low for a while, but the sense of impending chaos was palpable. Izuku, clad in his signature black attire, made his way through the hideout with a practiced ease. His interactions with the League were always delicate, requiring him to navigate their distrust and hostility while trying to extract valuable information. As he entered the main room, Shigaraki Tamura looked up, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "Areos, to what do we owe the pleasure?" Izuku gave a curt nod. "I've come to discuss the current situation. The Yakuza have been making moves, and I need to know what you're planning." Shigaraki's eyes narrowed, but he gestured for Izuku to take a seat. "We're always planning something. The Yakuza are a complication, but we're prepared for them. The real question is what you want from us." Izuku took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I need to understand your goals. The balance of power is shifting, and I need to know where you fit into that equation." Shigaraki leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. You want to know if we're going to make a move against the Yakuza? I'm sure you've heard the rumors. Izuku nodded. Yes, but I need to know more. If you have any plans or strategies, it would be helpful to know. Shigaraki's expression turned contemplative. We have our own agenda, but I suppose you could say that we're preparing for a bigger push. The Yakuza are a thorn in our side, but they're not our only concern. We're keeping an eye on the heroes as well. Izuku's interest was piqued. The heroes? Of course, Shigaraki replied with a hint of disdain. They're fractured and weak right now. It's the perfect time to strike. Izuku considered this. The League's goals were in line with his own, chaos and instability. But their methods were more extreme, and their endgame was less clear. I need to know if there's any way to avoid a full-blown conflict, Izuku said, trying to steer the conversation. Is there room for negotiation? Or is it going to be a fight to the end? Shigaraki chuckled. Negotiation? That's not really our style. We're not here to make deals, we're here to dismantle the current order. Izuku sighed. Then we're back to square one. I'll need to figure out how to manage this situation on my own. Shigaraki waved him off dismissively. Do what you need to do. But remember, if you cross us, there will be consequences. Izuku nodded, standing up to leave. Understood. I'll be in touch. Mustafu, safe house. As night fell, Izuku returned to the safe house, his mind buzzing with the information he'd gathered. The League was preparing for a major push, and their disdain for negotiation was a troubling sign. The balance of power in the city was precarious, and it was clear that things were about to get even more complicated. Rika was already there when he arrived, her expression unreadable as she looked up from a stack of documents she had been examining. How did it go? Not as productive as I hoped, Izuku replied, running a hand through his hair. The League is gearing up for something big, but they're not interested in negotiation. They're more focused on dismantling the current order. Rika's eyes widened slightly. That's not good. If they're making a push, it's going to throw everything into chaos. I know, Izuku said, his voice heavy with frustration. And the Yakuza are still a wild card. They're not showing their full hand yet. Rika stood up, her expression determined. We need to act quickly. If the League and the Yakuza both make their moves, the city won't be able to handle it. Izuku nodded. Agreed. We need to find a way to manage the situation, keep the city from descending into complete chaos. Rika's gaze softened slightly. I'll keep digging into the Yakuza. Maybe I can find out more about their plans and figure out a way to use that information to our advantage. Izuku managed a small smile. Thanks. I appreciate it. The tension between them was still present, but there was a sense of mutual understanding. They were both driven by the same goal, to maintain some semblance of order in a city on the brink of collapse. As they worked late into the night, the weight of their responsibilities hung over them. The city's fate was uncertain, and the choices they made in the coming days would have far-reaching consequences. But despite the tension and the uncertainty, there was a sense of purpose that kept them moving forward. Chapter text. The air in the safe house hung heavy with the weight of uncertainty. It had been hours since Izuku returned from the League's hideout, and though Rika had managed to gather a few more scraps of information from the Yakuza, it wasn't enough to paint a clear picture. The city's underworld was stirring, and any moment now, the fragile alliances would fracture. Izuku sat at the table, eyes flicking back and forth across a map of Mustafu. Pins marked key territories, and strings connected their movements, heroes, villains, and vigilantes, all shifting in a silent war. Rika leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed as she watched him work. We're running out of time, she said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. The League's not going to wait forever. They're planning a big push, and if the Yakuza retaliate, the city will tear itself apart. Izuku sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. We need leverage, something to slow them down. The Yakuza are still playing their cards close to their chest, and if we can't figure out what their next move is. His words trailed off as a soft chime echoed through the room. Rika's eyes snapped to the small tablet on the table, and Izuku grabbed it. A secure message flashed on the screen, encrypted, but with a familiar signature. Looks like someone's finally talking, Rika muttered, moving closer. Izuku opened the message, and his eyes narrowed as he read it. We have a problem. A pro-hero's gone rogue, off-grid. They're targeting both sides. Get to the warehouse on 43rd. Now. He set the tablet down, his mind racing. A rogue hero. That's new. Rika's brow furrowed. Targeting both sides. What kind of hero goes after villains and vigilantes? The kind that doesn't care about the rules, Izuku replied. He stood, grabbing his coat. We need to check it out. If a rogue hero is in play, this could throw everything off balance. It might even buy us some time. Rika hesitated. This could be a trap, Izuku. Both the League and the Yakuza have people everywhere. What if they're using this to lure us out? Izuku met her gaze, his expression firm. We don't have a choice. If a pro-hero's gone rogue, they're not playing by the usual rules. They'll be a threat to everyone, including us. She stared at him for a moment longer before nodding. Fine, but we go in prepared. If this goes south, we're not sticking around to play hero. Izuku smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. The streets were quiet as they made their way to the warehouse on 43rd. Shadows clung to the alleyways, and the occasional flicker of streetlights cast eerie glows on the crumbling buildings. Izuku and Rika moved in silence, both on edge, their senses heightened. When they reached the warehouse, they slipped in through a side entrance, careful to avoid detection. The place was dimly lit, filled with stacks of old crates and machinery covered in dust. It looked abandoned, but something felt off. There was a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Izuku crouched low, scanning the area. Stay close. We don't know who or what we're dealing with. Rika nodded, her eyes sweeping the room. They moved deeper into the warehouse, weaving between crates and scaffolding, their footsteps barely audible. As they reached the center, they spotted a figure standing in the middle of the open space, their back turned. The figure was tall, clad in a tattered hero costume that had seen better days. Their cape was shredded, and their mask was cracked, obscuring their face. In their hand was a glowing weapon, something that hummed with energy, casting a blue light around the room. Izuku's breath caught. He recognized the stance, the familiar weapon. Mirko. The figure turned slowly, and Izuku's heart sank. It wasn't Mirko, but it was someone who had once stood alongside her. A pro-hero who had vanished from the public eye months ago. The glowing weapon in their hand crackled with unstable energy. You're Areos, right? The hero's voice was low, almost detached. I've heard about you. Izuku narrowed his eyes, stepping forward cautiously. And you are? The hero chuckled bitterly. I used to be relevant. A protector of the city. Now, I'm just cleaning up the mess that the heroes left behind. Rika's hand hovered near her concealed weapon, her gaze sharp. You're going after villains and vigilantes alike. Why? The rogue hero's grip on the weapon tightened. Because none of you are doing anything about it. The heroes, they've failed. This whole system has failed. So, I'm taking things into my own hands. Izuku exchanged a glance with Rika, then turned back to the hero. You can't fix this by going rogue. All you're doing is making things worse. If you keep this up, the city's going to tear itself apart. That's where you're wrong, the hero snapped. I'm not making it worse. I'm cleaning house. And if you're smart, you'll get out of my way. Before Izuku could respond, a noise echoed from the back of the warehouse. The hero tensed, their eyes snapping toward the sound. Looks like you're not the only ones interested in this little meeting, they muttered. Izuku's stomach twisted. They had walked into a trap, but not one set for them. He signaled to Rika, and they both moved into defensive positions as footsteps echoed through the warehouse. From the shadows, a group of masked figures emerged, League members. Toga, Twice, and Dabi stepped forward, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Well, look what we have here, Toga cooed, twirling a knife in her hand. A little gathering. I love parties. Dabi's gaze flicked to Izuku. You didn't tell us you'd be bringing a guest, Areos. I thought we had an understanding. Izuku gritted his teeth. This isn't what it looks like. Twice grinned, pulling a mask from his pocket. Too late for that, buddy. Looks like we're all in this together now. The rogue hero raised their weapon, the energy crackling with increasing intensity. You think I'm scared of a few villains? I've been waiting for this. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest. Everything was spiraling out of control. If a fight broke out here, it would be the spark that ignited the powder keg. He glanced at Rika, who gave him a small nod. There was no backing out now. Everyone, stand down, Izuku shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. If we fight here, we'll all lose. There's no winning this. Dabi smirked, flames dancing around his fingertips. Maybe I like losing. Toga giggled. And I like watching people bleed. The rogue hero took a step forward, and Izuku felt the heat of their weapon surge. This was it, the moment when everything would fall apart. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that one wrong move would ignite a conflict they couldn't win. The rogue hero's grip on their weapon tightened, and the hum of energy grew louder. Dabi's flames flickered brighter, casting long shadows across the warehouse. Listen to me. Izuku's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. If we fight, it won't just be us who suffer. The Yakuza are watching, the heroes are weakened, and the city can't take another war. We'll all be caught in the crossfire. For a moment, silence settled over the group. Toga twirled her knife absent-mindedly, her eyes darting between Izuku and the rogue hero. Dabi's smirk faltered slightly, though his flames didn't diminish. But it was the rogue hero who broke the silence, their voice dripping with bitterness. You talk like someone who still believes this system can be saved. It's already broken beyond repair. Heroes, villains, vigilantes, you're all part of the same problem. You think talking will stop what's coming? Izuku stepped forward, keeping his posture non-threatening but firm. I don't think talking will fix everything. But fighting right now will make it worse. There's still a chance to control the damage. The rogue hero scoffed, but something in their expression wavered. Control the damage? You're delusional. The only way to fix this is to tear it all down. Dabi let out a low chuckle, the flames on his hands flickering ominously. I like the sound of that. Chaos suits me just fine. Before Izuku could respond, Rika's voice cut through the tension. We don't have time for this. She stepped forward, her gaze locked on the rogue hero. You're outnumbered and out of your mind if you think you can take all of us on. The rogue hero's eyes flicked between the league members, Izuku and Rika. The tension in their body remained, but the growing realization of their precarious situation was evident. Izuku seized the moment. You're not alone in this, he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. You feel like the system's failed you, like everything's falling apart. But going rogue won't change that. There's another way to do this. The rogue hero's grip on their weapon loosened, just for a second. But that second was all it took for Dabi to make his move. Flames erupted from his hands, roaring toward the rogue hero in a blazing arc. Izuku barely had time to react, throwing himself between the two and activating his tactical barrier, a shimmering field of energy that absorbed the brunt of the fire. The heat seared through the air, but the barrier held. Dabi, Izuku barked, his voice laced with frustration. Stand down. But Dabi wasn't listening. He grinned, eyes wild with excitement as the flames licked higher. You talk too much, Areos. This is how we get things done. The rogue hero, momentarily caught off guard, recovered quickly. With a sharp twist of their wrist, they swung their weapon, sending a shockwave of energy in Dabi's direction. The blast collided with his flames, sending sparks and debris flying across the warehouse. The fight had begun. Izuku cursed under his breath, ducking behind a stack of crates as the rogue hero and Dabi exchanged blows. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the crackle of energy. Toga, ever the opportunist, giggled as she leapt into the fray, her knife flashing in the dim light as she circled the rogue hero. Rika darted forward, trying to cut through the chaos to reach Izuku. We need to get out of here. This whole place is going to come down on our heads. Izuku's mind raced. They couldn't stay here, not with the league going all out and a rogue hero with nothing left to lose. But leaving now would mean abandoning any chance of controlling the situation. A sharp crack echoed through the warehouse as the rogue hero's weapon clashed with Dabi's flames again, sending shockwaves through the walls. Izuku made his decision. Rika, grab what you can. We're getting out of here, he shouted over the noise. Rika didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed a small device from her belt and threw it toward the rogue hero. It exploded in a burst of smoke, filling the room with a thick, impenetrable fog. Izuku sprinted toward the nearest exit, Rika close behind. "Move," Izuku yelled, pushing through the fog. The sound of fighting still raged behind them, but the smoke had given them the cover they needed to slip away unnoticed. They burst out of the side entrance and into the cool night air, panting heavily. The street was empty, save for a few stray cats that darted away at the sudden commotion. Izuku leaned against the wall, catching his breath as Rika scanned the area for any signs of pursuit. "Did we lose them?" she asked, wiping the sweat from her brow. "For now," Izuku replied, his voice tight. "But it's only a matter of time before the League figures out where we went." Rika frowned, her gaze hardening. "This is getting out of hand. If the League is willing to start a fight with a rogue hero in the middle of the city, then they're closer to making their big move than we thought." Izuku nodded grimly. "And now we've got another problem. That hero, they're dangerous. And they're not going to stop just because we left." Rika cursed under her breath. "We can't fight them and deal with the League and Yakuza at the same time." "We won't have to," Izuku said, his mind already working through the options. "We use this. Let the rogue hero keep the League and the Yakuza on edge. It'll buy us time to figure out our next move." Rika's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about letting that maniac run loose?" Izuku met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice. If we intervene now, we'll be caught in the middle of a war we can't win. But if we play it smart, we can use the chaos to our advantage." Rika didn't respond immediately, but the conflict in her eyes was clear. She hated the idea of letting the rogue hero continue unchecked, but the cold logic of Izuku's plan was undeniable. Finally, she sighed. "All right, we play this your way. But if things get worse..." "I know," Izuku said softly. "We'll deal with it." They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the city a faint backdrop to their thoughts. The lines between heroes, villains, and vigilantes had always been blurred, but tonight, those lines had all but disappeared. "We need to move," Izuku said at last, pushing off the wall. "The League's not going to stay distracted for long." Rika nodded, falling into step beside him. "And the rogue hero?" Izuku's eyes darkened as they disappeared into the night. "We'll keep an eye on them. But for now, let them be the distraction." To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.